Charlie Portis's Masters of Atlantis is a comedic epic. Over the course of something like 50 or 60 years, it tells the boom and bust tale of a secret Atlantean mystery cult. We are there at the cult's very beginnings in Europe immediately after the First World War, and we are there at its auspicious end and possible rebirth in a trailer park in Texas. We witness a whole cast of misfits, oddballs, quacks, and bachelors with too much time on their hands fall in and out of this cult, intrigued by the promise of ancient wisdom as an antidote to the uncertainty of modern times. We, the reader, are never given a direct glimpse into what this cult actually believes, but we are provided with several reasons, economic, social, and political, as to why someone might wish to become a master of nomanism. Did I mention this book is hilarious? John and I cover a wide range of topics today, touching on the search for certainty in a chaotic age, the influence of the passing of time on a cult such as this, and this book's hilarious and distinctly Midwestern sense of deadpan humor. We hope you enjoy the conversation.
Welcome, listeners, back to the Infinite Library. It's your favorite podcast about books, time, and the infinite. I'm your host, Ben.
I'm John, and it's dark in here.
It's dark in here. My friend, you know how bread is made. Well, listener, you might be aware of the secret gnomon reading that John and I just exchanged. Seeing we are actually masters of nomanism, and you, dear listener, are but perfect strangers. This is all by way of saying today we are covering Masters of Atlantis by Charlie Portis, a book about a type of cult that you get the entire history of the cult throughout the book, and the people who don't know about the cult are just mere perfect strangers, while John and I, who do know about the cult, are masters of nomanism.
Masters of Atlantis, if you will.
True.
Yeah, guys. Ben, this was your pick. This was my first Charlie Portis read, actually. I've seen the Coen brothers adaptation of True Grit, but I never actually read anything of his before. And man, good pick. We wanted to get away from ghosts and goblins and spooky stuff, and this was a great change of pace.
Yeah, a year or two ago, I got bit with the Portis bug, and I read literally everything that he ever wrote. And I had seen, like John, True Grit, which is a great movie, and I hadn't exactly realized how well the Coen brothers movie captures Portis's like deadpan humor, which makes his stuff for really some of the best comedic writing and reading you'll get anywhere. And I sort of had to press this on John with the same fervent urgency that one gets pressed to the Masters of Atlantis nomanism sacred text, the Codex Papus, onto the prospective cult members.
Yeah, speaking of pressing people into reading this book and film adaptations, I guess, one thing I learned as we were kind of doing our background research for this is a book that has only not been adapted to film kind of just by bad luck, it seems. This is apparently a huge obsession for everyone in kind of the Mr. Show-ish universe. I know David Cross apparently has the original cover illustration like tattooed on his arm. Bill Hader, I think, owns the rights for adapting this book, just hasn't gotten around to it yet.
Bill Hader technically owns Dog of the South, but Michael Cera owns Masters of Atlantis. Yeah.
They're fantastic.
Everyone, we might get a bunch of Portis adaptations in the ensuing years because, like, everyone who's involved in, the Mr. Show universe or, like, comedy has some, like, Portis experience in some degree or another.
Yeah. Which, Michael Cera, that's an interesting one. You know, I was reading this, and to me, it really struck me as a kind of Wes Anderson-y
definitely.
plot. Or not plot, but just kind of story. Like, I just, the way everything's described, it's got a very Wes Anderson vibe, whereas I I could see the Coens adapting this one. I don't know that it would land quite as well as True Grit did, because True Grit obviously has the really acidic tone that they really like, and this is a little bit more pleasant.
It's pleasant, it's funny, and there are modern parallels you could draw between the cult that's presented here and something like QAnon, but in this one everyone is relatively harmless, and in fact they're really lonely. And you get to see them sort of come together over this like made up pre-ancient or pre-modern ancient historical nonsense about triangles and spirals and the Poma, which is a hat that you wear on your head to signify that you are a master of nomanism. And I think also the Wes Anderson comparison is pretty apt, because I think a lot of Wes Anderson's tone is very dry and matter of fact, and Portis is absolutely so good at writing that way. And I think it works for this, which is a lot of his books, in fact, all of them except this one, are written in first person, and this is the only one that's written in third person. So I think it was him attempting to write this sort of epic of this cult that starts like, it was like after World War One, and then it ends somewhere in the like 60s or 70s, maybe.
Yeah, we'll talk a bit about like the passage of time. I know that's something we talked about wanting to be a topic for this book, but this really covers like kind of a very broad swath of the mid-century, I guess we'll call it. I think it starts in 1918, and it ends on kind of an ambiguous note, but it came out in 1985, and it's clearly ends, good bit before that. But the exact framing gets a little hazy. Portis, I learned, was a newspaper writer, which I think is always an interesting turn to make from journalist to novelist. I think you have a lot of novelists who try to be journalists at some point once they get popular enough, usually in the op-ed mold, which is to say just writing bullshit.
Oh, I saw something today and I'm going to make this stand in for everything. So.
But when you have someone kind of make the opposite turn, I find that it's not always for me, but there are very few careers I think prepare you better for like writing commercial fiction than being a journalist. Like Frank Herbert, famously a newspaper man, and I think in his hands he turns Dune into something that is legible to the average person in a way that someone more literarily minded simply would not have been able to. And I think Portis, not to the same extent, this is a much more down-to-earth kind of book than Dune, but he is able to take what in a more traditional writer's hands, I think would maybe get too zany or too in the weeds, and he keeps it very legible, very brisk. I think that there's like a version of this book that gets way more up its own ass about like the phony baloney theology and mythology of this cult, and loses sight of what the actual like point of the book is.
Yeah.
And he does not do that here.
And I think too, you can even see that sort of newspaperman's eye for the like character paragraph, because he does perfect paragraphs of like character introduction, and then that's all you get. You don't get a whole lot of psychology. You don't get a whole lot of like what is the meaning of this character? Literally, a character enters, you get a paragraph description, and then Portis is on to basically doing the scope of this cult. And I think the fact that he's not, I would say, a fiction writer and more of a newspaper man allows him to keep an eye on like the arc of everything as opposed to sort of individual moments. And we don't even get a actually word for word sample of what's in the actual like sort of cult textbook until almost the very end of the book, because at that point it doesn't really matter. And so I think you can really see his style, and I think it really makes the thing read very breezily, and it doesn't become too ponderous and sort of like, what does it all mean?
Absolutely. So in the interest of both kind of getting a little bit more into the story itself and illustrating that really great eye for character, I just want to read the opening section of the first chapter where we meet our protagonist, for lack of a better term. Young Lamar Jimerson went to France in 1917 with the American Expeditionary Forces, serving with the 1st Balloon Section, stumbling about in open fields holding one end of a long rope, and then later as a telephone switchboard operator at AEF headquarters in Chaumont. It was there on the banks of the Marne River that he first came to hear of the Gnomon Society. He was walking about Chaumont one night with his hands in his pockets when he was approached by a dark, bow-legged man who offered to trade a small book for 2 packages of old gold cigarettes. The book has to do with the interpretation of dreams. Corporal Jimerson did not smoke, nor did he have much interest in such a book, but he felt sorry for the ragged fellow, and so treated him to a good supper at the Hotel Davos.
And so thus the first con happens, more or less. Like, that man clearly just wants some food and a place to stay.
Yes.
And he dangles the prospect of hidden or forbidden knowledge in front of him.
So that man, over the course of a couple paragraphs, reveals that he is a Greek named Stephen, an Armenian named Steve, a couple other ethnicities and names before he finally reveals what is actually, not what's actually going on, but what he says is going on, which is that he has secretly been trying to bring Jimerson into the Gnomon Society, which is the kind of cult fraternal order that Ben was referencing earlier. This man soon disappears, leaving Jimerson with just this book of what is implied to be just complete and utter nonsense.
Yeah, it has a lot of triangles, it has a lot of spirals. He gets initiated in various secret rites, such as the Night of the Figs, which is not explained, and then another night where he has to run around with his mouth open, I think. And yeah, once he completes those, he gets into Gnomonism. Also, John, I wondered if I was thinking about something. So initially, this guy that comes up to him says, I have a book about the interpretations of dreams. And then, wait, hold on. He has another book. And so I was wondering, and that book is the Codex Pappus, the made-up nonsense. Now, I don't know if you remember, when was Interpretation of Dreams written by Freud? It would have been after this?
That's a great question. Yeah, Interpretation of Dreams came out in 1899, so at this point, about 20 years old.
So the reason I bring this up is I find it fascinating, and I think this says pretty much something significant about everyone in this book. So given the choice between Freud, the Interpretation of Dreams, and some made-up nonsense from the antique era, Lamar Jimerson picks the made-up nonsense. And notice Interpretation of Dreams isn't named, but I think you're given sort of like, here is something that maybe could sort of influence your worldview positively. Here's something that's a lot more mysterious and is more important, old, and is secret. And they immediately pick that one.
Yeah.
And I think that is something interesting, one, about this book's approach to like learning and explaining the truth of like the world of who you are. And I think you could also see that reflected into people that get really into theory without kind of like sort of treating it as something you could use as a tool to understand, and more like sort of like a thing you could wear as like a piece of clothing.
Yeah.
So like, people on Twitter always post about like being this kind of theory head. And it's like, sure, maybe they are using it as a tool, but they're sort of treating it like, something you could use to meet other people with, which is kind of what they treat the Codex Pappus in this book, and not as like maybe something more substantial like Interpretation of Dreams.
Yeah, I think that this book, in a way, it's about, for lack of kind of a better way to put it, like the comforting power of nonsense.
Yeah.
That there is like a part of the human brain that just really loves getting completely lost in puzzles and, fantasy. I think so much about like the type of person who gets obsessed with Game of Thrones or Transformers and like commits their life to like maintaining the Wikipedia for that like media property.
Yeah.
And I think that this is like what's going on here with Colonel Jimerson and the Codex Pappus. It's something similar where you find this thing that it doesn't have a bottom because there isn't anything at the bottom. It's just a thing you can get lost in.
Yeah.
But there's something very comforting in being able to lose yourself in something. And yeah, he's not the only one who does. Over the course of kind of this first section of the book, we kind of see him build the order.
Right.
The original person who gave him the Codex Pappus disappears mysteriously
and is never never mentioned again. So,
yeah, he never reappears. There's no grand denouement at the end of this book where he shows back up and reveals it was all bullshit to everybody or something like that. He is a con artist who probably picked this book up from somewhere else, and he got his 2 packs of cigarettes, and he is on to the next thing.
Well, and also, like, throughout the sort of initiation period, Lamar Jimerson ends up buying him more meals and a suit of clothes. Yeah. So he basically just takes Jimerson for all he's worth in return for this, like, again, secret knowledge. And I think to what you said, John, regarding, like, like the pleasure in nonsense. The more you know about nonsense, the more you actually think you're sort of an established nonsense person. And so when he basically, after the guy dips, Lamar is basically like, the book says, he committed the entire work to memory, all 88 pages of Atlantean puzzles, Egyptian riddles, and extended alchemical metaphors. He knew every cone and triangle by heart, just as he knew the 13 hermetical precepts and how to recognize the 3 secret teachers, Nandor, Principato, and the Lame One, should they make one of their rare appearances before him in disguise. Soon, he began to wonder if he might not be an adept. So, the more you know, the more closer you get in. And so then, as John said, like, he tries to establish this order, and he basically realizes that he's the head honcho. He's the guy who knows. And he, of course, gets somebody else involved, one of the other main characters, Sidney Henn, who is a Britishman.
A British aristocrat who's living in kind of the same town that Lamar finds himself in. He kind of attaches to Sidney a little bit like the tramp attached to him, because Sidney is like most of the aristocracy of Perfidus Albion, a big one for bullshit and pseudo-mystical gobbledygook. And pretty quickly, we realize Hen is maybe a little bit sharper than Lamar. He he tells Lamar that, oh, you're a master, and so am I.
We are the two masters.
Yeah. So then he kind of gently implies to Lamar, you should go to America, and I'll handle things here in Europe. You go back to America, and you set up the order over there. And Jimerson, being, just a rosy-cheeked doughboy, does just so, and he heads back to Indiana.
Yeah, Indiana, and also I think the fact that it's Indiana, I didn't mention this up top, but one of the reasons I love Charlie Portis is I think he is a sort of what I would feel comfortable saying is a Midwest author, because I think he grew up in Arkansas, and he eventually moved back there after working as a newspaperman, and I think he gets that in the Midwest there's this sort of pressure to become a character, to deal with the sort of overwhelming sense of normalcy. And I think a lot of this book is sort of all of these characters who have become characters due to expectations, social norms, the space in the Midwest even, and they're all just kind of bouncing off each other like marbles or like billiard balls on a pool table, and their interactions are kind of the book. But I think like that's one sense I think he's a Midwestern author, and I think also the kind of like droll matter-of-fact humor. And those two combined, I think it makes him particularly Midwest. And again, he sets up in Indiana and eventually establishes the Temple of Gnomonism in the fashionable suburb of Gary, Indiana, Burnett. So the most fashionable suburb. Yeah.
So that kind of is where things start off. And it's at this point that the book kind of starts, I don't want to say it plays with time, but time starts moving a little quicker. Like, this is kind of a book, it's kind of a picaresque, I'd say.
Yeah.
It's really a novel of episodes that are connected by the tissue of this organization, the Gnomon Society, but there's not like an overarching plot per se here. Like we're not moving towards anything except just the future.
And if anything, the plot is sort of the plot of Gnomonism as a cult.
Yes.
It has its rising and it's falling, and it has various people enter and exit. And there's, when we don't have to talk about this now, but there's eventually the split between the Sidney Henn school of Gnomonism and Lamar Jimerson's school. And that sort of, I would say, constitutes the plot. But yeah, it's largely just sort of episode after episode of characters bouncing into each other. And we'd never get the sort of truth of Gnomonism. And the book, we also talk about this later, flirts with maybe saying it is all true, but of course never says it directly. So, because that's not really the point, honestly. But yeah.
So that brings us, I think, to our kind of third main character, actually. So we have Lamar Jimerson, how shall I put this? The somewhat erudite, but also rather dim head of Gnomonism. He has a great head for coming up with this stuff, but he's not much of a salesman, we learn pretty quickly. And then we have Sidney Henn, who is, again, a lord of the Swamp Island, and
originally, it should be noted, he does very well in London, while Lamar Jimerson does not do as well. because
Yes.
people in London are predisposed to like this kind of stuff, is what the book is kind of saying.
Yeah.
And then he sets up sort of like, he starts like hobnobbing with like your Aleister Crowleys and like your other types of people at that time, while as Lamar Jimerson is just sort of plugging away at the dream in Indiana, and he starts like convincing people using like door-to-door salesmen. Like he has one or two friends who are door-to-door salesmen, and they go like, I have some things to sell you, but I have something that is worth its weight in gold. And then they show you the Codex Papyrus, or like the sort of intro to the book. So yeah, like those were the two sort of, I would say, main players. And then of course we get the third person,
Popper.
Austin Popper. Yeah, what
Yes.
a character.
So Popper is, I think it's fair to say, Ben, your favorite character in this novel.
Yes, yeah.
I hesitate to say that he is anything less than mine as well. He is the guy who connects with Jimerson in Indiana and is able to actually take nomanism to the point where it really takes off. And he is a true blue American snake oil salesman.
Yeah, he's a pull yourself up by your bootstraps one day at a time, just keep telling the people what they want without actually understanding any of it salesman. Like he is all rhetoric, which is why he's such a fascinating character. His intro paragraph should tell you everything you need to know about them. This is the Portis intro paragraph. Austin Popper was the mail boy. That was the job description, but he was not really very boyish at the age of 19, or maybe it was 24, or even 30. Even at that time, Popper was coy about his age and his origins, and no one could pin him down on these things. Popper was quick in every sense of the word. His physical movements were quick and sure, and he could learn a new task in short order and execute it with confidence. He had a ready fund of information gleaned from newspapers and popular magazines. He kept his eyes open. He remembered names. His charm was effective on both men and women, and even the misanthropic Huggins became fond of him. Maps and Epps thought him just a shade ambitious, but they too found his company pleasant against their will. So the fact that he knows all of the slogans for like selling people things, and he's quick, and he started as the mailroom, but then he climbs the ranks basically, and like he's sort of like a funny, inept version of somebody like the main guy from the movie Nightcrawler, where that's presented as sort of like this horrifying kind of like neoliberalism American Psycho. In this one, he's just like inept.
Well,
yeah,
like he is as close as you could probably get in like the 1920s, 1930s to like one of these AI like NFT like grifter VC guys that we have now, who is really into talking about how they're a founder.
Yeah,
because they've started like 20 startups to try to sell 8 pictures to the dumbest people in the world. And crucially, that is kind of what Popper managed to do, again, in a kind of a 1920s, 1930s way. Crucially, what the book makes clear is the Depression starts.
Yeah. And this is the sort of, we said the time, this is where time starts factoring in.
Yes. So the 20s is kind of Lamar attempting to build this and it not working. The 30s hit, everybody loses their job. All of a sudden you have all these men with all this time on their hands and nothing to do with it. And who walks into their life but Austin Popper? It says that he intentionally kind of streamlines and simplifies nomanism as much as he possibly can. He removes a lot of the more outwardly occult elements.
And the triangles.
Yeah. Basically turning it into like a more, I guess, traditional like fraternal organization or just like social club. And I think there's something very interesting here about about where people go for comfort in desperate times, so to speak. Ben, you made a really interesting and I think somewhat obvious comparison. I think I even saw a couple articles on this when I was looking up kind of supplementary stuff for this episode. There are quite a few people who've kind of drawn parallels between this and like the QAnon phenomenon. And I think that those are reasonable. I think that there's really there's something that can be said here to draw a lot of parallels between QAnon and this, but also like a lot of varieties of like, I don't really know exactly, I don't have like a perfect word to describe like this kind of ecosystem, but kind of the trad, not necessarily like cath ecosystem, like kind of the weird like traddy space on the internet right now where you have kind of all these people puffing smoke out of each other's asses about like how they don't eat seed oils because,
or like better architecture.
Classical art. Like there's this very strange space that I think we've both scene, like Bronze Age pervert, all that kind of nonsense. And, I think that in difficult times, there is this very human belief in, like, I'm going to find something eternal. I'm going to find something with like a pedigree, that goes back a ways, because the world I'm living in feels very unstable and very strange. And I think for some people, that pedigree is just like, oh, I'm going to like be MAGA and be like, oh, why can't it be the 50s again?
Yeah.
And for some people, it's like, oh, I need to be a crusader. And kind of like you said with the Freud bit earlier, which I think is interesting. I don't know like if that was intentional on Portis's part, but I think that's really, really interesting.
I may be reading a little too much into it.
But still, like, I think that is kind of what dichotomy it is. It's like you can either, when you find yourself in a world that doesn't make sense, you can look at it through a number of different lenses.
Yeah.
And one of the things you can do is you can try to just strip all the mystical nonsense out and just take like a hard look at the world. And that's reading Freud, reading Marx, reading any number of serious theorists on things, or you can start reading 4chan and get really into, like, when's JFK Jr. coming back?
You can get into Nandor, Principato, and the Lame One.
Exactly,
the three
exactly.
deities.
And crucially, the interesting thing too is, and this is maybe what we will not see in our lifetime, is kind of the outcome of this weird ecosystem. The Gnomon Society immediately begins to fail as soon as World War II starts.
Yeah. In fact, that's basically the decline.
Economy gets good.
Yeah. There's a war boom economy. Everybody realizes, well, one, there's a war going on, and two, like the boom from the war. Everybody's like, oh, I have something to do now, basically.
Yeah.
And like the sort of the quest for answers, like the answers get supplied in like other ways.
Yes.
And the book says crucially, like nobody has any free time to like sort of find these.
Yes.
I also wanted to point out briefly I think it's interesting that, like, the book doesn't really go back to, like, the reason why, because I think once the World War II happens, suddenly you get all of these weird eccentrics sort of orbiting the main people, and, like, those people are kind of already, the book kind of says, like, predisposed to this stuff.
Yeah.
Babak, which we might talk about later. He's just sort of like a bachelor who likes studying things, and somehow he finds this.
Well, and I think that like there's a historical element there. You know, I'm not an expert on this stuff, but I spent a good chunk of my life. I was fascinated with groups like the Freemasons and the Rosicrucians, and like a lot of those groups still exist in some form or another. But yeah, their heydays were all like before World War II, basically. Like obviously post World War II, we have kind of stuff like Scientology, which I think probably we could also draw some parallels here. But yeah, kind of the idea that like, oh, this magical brotherhood was going to get like popular again brings a little false. And so I think he does not, Portis, I think very wisely does not kind of get into like strong alternative history here.
Right. And I think Popper also, it's described, was before World War II, he was like doing huge rallies and he was working the crowd up, and he had like a talking parrot named Squanto, and he was like going on he was getting a lot of press attention. And then suddenly it says, the press grew tired of Gnomons and moved on to other things. The public likewise lost interest almost overnight. War was coming. The country was preparing for a mighty crusade, and their Popper rallies suddenly had a shabby, dated air of selfishness about them. The crowds dwindled away to nothing. Popper had run out his string, or so it appeared. So, like, and then, of course, then he starts doing other things. But, yeah, like, suddenly, like, the decline happens, and I don't think, like, Gnomonism really recovers from that, which means the rest of the book suddenly takes all of these interesting detours. And I think we could probably mention time now, because I think, John, you had mentioned that you were worried that this was going to have a sort of Forrest Gump approach to time, which is like, now it's the 60s, now it's the 70s, like, and everyone is like wearing period appropriate attire and like listening to period appropriate music, and like only rarely does time intrude on what happens. And I think a lot of that reflects on how Lamar Jimerson is like sunk into his studies. And there's a hilarious bit where he's so in the temple all the time, and it's like Portis says something like, just look something up, he would say with a smile, and just go back to his book. And like, he wouldn't be talking to anyone. He would just be like looking through stuff in the library. And then later that smile begins to grow more terrible, according to Portis, because he's been doing it for like decades at this point, like towards the end of the book. And so I think like having time intrude kind of comments on how inward these characters are as opposed to like outward facing, but also this isn't like a Forresty Gump part of time. Like, it only intrudes like materially, maybe, or something like that.
I think it's really interesting. So kind of to take a little bit of a step back. So again, we hit the 40s basically, and all of a sudden we're in the war. The book makes a very interesting kind of detour, and we kind of stop. It's the first time where we really totally leave behind Jimerson for a while, and we just follow Popper on kind of the side quest where he goes out with this Romanian doctor to California, where they're going to somehow like try to grow this like weed that they're going to somehow be able to refine into gold.
Yeah, bagweed apparently collects very tiny gold flecks, and Popper sees this and goes, more bagweed equals more gold. so then they just start growing tons of bagweed, and somehow Gillespie is convinced. And the reason Gillespie is convinced is he has joined almost all of the orders you just mentioned, and he's even more intrigued by this one that he doesn't know a lot about. He has cards for Rosicrucians, he has cards for Masons, he has cards for all these other ones, and he's like, I want to know more about this one, and Popper kind of dangles it in front of him and then tells him about the gold thing, and then they just move to Colorado, basically.
Yeah. And I think it's really interesting because basically then Popper kind of gets thwarted at the end of that story. He doesn't make any money, he doesn't get the girl, He
becomes a drunk.
And then we head back to Jimerson and we see, this is where things have kind of fallen since kind of the salad days. And then, time kind of resumes. We're kind of back in the temple where we were before that detour. And like I was telling you, I was a little worried kind of just when the time started passing in this novel. There's a phenomenon that I don't have like a fully developed theory of, but it's something I feel like I've seen enough kind of in passing. And it's what I call it the boomer novel. I guess I'm sure there are plenty of authors who like aren't technically boomers who've written these kinds of books, and their audiences were boomers though. And like I said, it's the Forrest Gump literature. It's the guy who got an English degree from like a state university, and he's like, I'm going to write the great American novel, and he writes a book about history as a boomer sees it, which is basically maybe like the Depression through like however long time has gone on. He's asking questions like, what's America? And I was a little worried this was gonna be like that, and thankfully it wasn't.
And I think too, you kind of get I think the Portis newspaper angle is really good here, because I think you could get a little too involved with like the big idea of the flow of time. And a newspaper person is just like, I just need the facts. And it's just like, at this date, things started to decline, at this date, the war happened. Although we didn't mention the really funny bit where Popper thinks he can go to Washington and convince the bigwigs at Washington that Nomanism could help with the war effort. And there's that wonderful joke about how he has a proposal for compressed air, and Lamar Jimerson is like, air, and Popper's like, compressed air, sir. It really packs a punch. And then of course they don't get seen at all, and like Popper literally thinks he can just go there without like knowing anyone, and they'll listen to him, and of course they don't.
Well, he's been a big fish in a small pond at this point.
That's true.
We get back in the 50s, and things have declined a good bit. And this is kind of, again, where the novel, it doesn't lose momentum, but things slow down a lot. And the passage of time gets a lot hazier. So, like we said, the book starts off with kind of a very distinct, like, sense of time. He went to France in 1917, and then, we hear about when the war ends, and, et cetera, et cetera. After World War II ends, the timeline gets a lot hazier, and that is partially, like you said, a product of like how insularized people are. I think it's also kind of in a weird way, like there's not big historical events happening that are affecting these people in the same way. And I think part of that's because they're older. This is definitely a book like that's thinking a lot about aging, in a way that I think is interesting. But yeah, the timeline gets so much hazier that we kind of stop getting years quoted as precisely till we kind of reach the end where, like Ben said, it could be the 60s, it could be the 70s, it could even conceivably be like the very late 50s.
Right, yeah.
And it's not clear.
Yeah, and so, like, some other stuff that happens involves, like, well, Sidney Henn, basically, he gets poisoned, he's recovering, he starts, like, a thing to trick people into buying his special program, but then he suddenly gets revitalized, and he starts kind of doing his own stuff. And originally, he had basically fought Jimerson, which we didn't mention. I would say that was like right at the end of the Salad Days, was like when Sidney Henn suddenly turns on the Jimerson school, and he talks about how they've let too many people in and they need to be more insular to kind of like, otherwise they're perverting the mystical meanings of the Codex Pappus.
Which again, I think is interesting because again, he's British. Like, he's coming from a milieu where it's like a secret society like this is supposed to be something for the right sort of people.
Yeah.
Whereas in America, it's a scam. It's about getting as many people paying into this thing as you can possibly get. Which, yeah, you have to file off a lot of the the content to make that work. But you're going to get a lot more people interested.
And this is, I think, some of the stuff Portis excels at. He began his remarks with an attack on Popper, calling him Austin Rotter and a low American farceur and a confidence trickster of the very lowest type, and went on to bring full and stinging indictment against American nomadism. No doubt, he said, the leadership in Indiana, USA meant well, but it was very weak. Substantial changes could be expected now that Henn was on the scene. As Grand Prior of World Nomanry, he was considering revoking the charter of the American Temple in Burnett, and would certainly do so if that temple did not soon purge itself of Popper and Popperism. So, like, the fact that they're fighting, and like you said, he was trying to make it more interesting, and then we get one of the funniest bits where Jimerson orders people to start defacing Henn's books. Mr. Jimerson, Henn orders people to deface Mr. Jimerson's books. Henn stepped up the campaign, initiating the Battle of the Books by having his people remove Mr. Jimerson books from libraries and bookstores and destroy them. Popper countered with a program of defacement, ordering the Jimerson men to fill in all the closed loops of letters in Henn's books with green ink, to underline passages at random in that same green ink, and to scroll such comments in the margins as, huh? And is this guy serious? And I don't get it. In red ink, the aim being to break the reader's concentration and so subvert the message. So, but that does happen a bit before we got to where you were saying, John, that like towards the sort of the fog of the 50s kind of, where like, they're not bringing in new people. Portis basically makes it clear that the factional suburb of Burnett has declined with Gary's deindustrialization, and that like the temple that was there is in disrepair. Yeah, and like
there's a gang of street toughs.
yeah.
Who they're a motorcycle gang without motorcycles, I think is how he puts it.
Yeah, and they just kind of hang out outside, and they're like, everyone's like, don't let them in here. And there's only like 5 people living in the temple. Like,
they have tramps breaking in.
They have tramps breaking in, and then like they have a bunch of reclining chairs because they don't buy furniture, and they're just like reclining chairs in the one big room in the temple in front of the fire, and like that's like where nomanism is at that point, basically. Like nobody's really interested.
So there is one episode we have not chatted about yet that I do think is both interesting and also, again, kind of illustrative, kind of this broader point we're making. And that's the abortive attempt to run Lamar Jimerson for governor of Indiana.
Yeah, that's what's going to bring us back is one of the nomadists in office, is what Popper says, basically.
So yeah, after the war, Popper basically, after kind of the gold adventure goes nowhere, he fails the side quest. He disappears for the duration of the rest of the 40s, and then he just shows up back at the temple, and he's like, oh yeah, I've been really busy. Anyway, we're going to run you for governor.
And he keeps talking about how he was married to a nice woman named Meg, and then anytime they ask about him, he's like, I don't want to talk about it. So, probably a lie. So
maybe a lie, maybe she's not a nice lady.
And we get one of the funniest small characters in the book, the potential author of the Jimerson biography, which will get everybody worked up to have him as governor, named Dub Polton, or W.W. Polton, who has one of, I think, as I was telling John, one of the funniest character intros. For all his jaunty prose, W.W. Polton was a glum little man. Everything he saw seemed to let him down in some way. He was so small that he wore boys' clothes, little suits of skimpy juvenile cut, the coats chopped off very short. He had the wizened walnut face of a jockey. He was rude. Time after time, he cut Mr. Jimerson short in his reminiscence. He had bad table manners, and he scratched the parquet floors with the metal taps on his zippered, high-heeled ankle bootlets. He drank one Pepsi-Cola after another, leaving behind a trail of wet bottles atop fine pieces of furniture. So he's sort of like an unpleasant author type, like a hack author who just churns this stuff out. And as you know, according to Popper, he's a great man, and he's written a lot of famous stuff, all of which Jimerson has never heard of.
And all under pseudonyms.
Yeah, and all under pseudonyms. There's a long list of Popper asking if he's read this author and going, that was Dub. But then they work on the biography, and the biography is real bad because he's been using the occasion to write the biography to repurpose materials he had working on a book from Peru, about Peru. So he ends up talking about Peruvian metals unknown to science, which Jimerson takes umbrage with, obviously. But the thing that I wanted to point out is that the book gets called Hoosier Wizard, which, you know, the KKK started in Indiana. So there's sort of this like strange like play, I think, with the words that Portis is doing. I'm not sure what it means exactly, other than like Polton being a bad author is funny, but the fact that it's called Hoosier Wizard and that he's running for office seems like kind of a nod towards KKK members in government or something like that.
Well, actually, that's really interesting that you bring that up, because something I think is really fascinating and like kind of, again, crucial to like why this book works as a comedy is that nomonism, unlike a lot of other like similar schools of thought, and given the time period this book is set in, it's not racist.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
There's nothing in nomonism about like root races or like the perfidous Hebrews.
Yeah, or some horrible claims as to like one person we should blame or something.
It's you get the impression that like nomonism is like pretty enlightened racially, so to speak. They don't like, there's no members who are of color that like are mentioned, but they have like a butler who isn't, he's a butler, but he's really kind of taking advantage. Like he has to clean, but like he's really kind of taking advantage of them. Like he stays there because they don't ask him to do very much.
Yeah, he's basically their friend. And I would say the only racist stuff in this is Popper is racist to Gulescu because
who's Romanian.
Who's Romanian, but he keeps like misrepresenting his race, and it's because he hates him personally. It's like they start off and then they become like the two, like it's like they become roommates who hate each other, and then there's a lot of stuff of like Popper misremembering what his race is, and then Gillespie getting really mad at him.
You know, it's really interesting. Again, as someone who read some of the inspirations for this stuff, and this is not like universal. You know, like Rosicrucianism doesn't have like a lot of like racial elements, but like Theosophy, which is definitely where this is drawing a lot of like the content from, is just incredibly racist. I mean, you got a lot of kind of people in this milieu who are very racist, if not like outright Nazis. Like Aleister Crowley wasn't a Nazi, but like incredibly racist.
And well, yeah, and the fact that like it's in Indiana and it's called Hoosier Wizard. And I think that's Portis saying, like, yeah, some people who are racist in these societies are in the government.
Yeah. But again, I think that maybe that's also another reason why nomonism is kind of doomed, is that there's no hook to keep you in, because like the KKK still exists.
Yeah.
Like nomonism, I mean, it never existed, but I feel like there's an element where, again, because there's no content, even bad content here. It's the only people this thing ends up appealing to are people who either have just very weird brains or who got into it at a certain point in time, and it's just all they have.
Right. Yeah. And as you said, John, I think when we were talking about this book before we got on, a lot of what's depicted as why Jimerson is in the library all day is like mental masturbation, where it's like this sort of mystical stuff Like at one point he starts somebody's like, hey, I'm really worried we don't have enough members, and he goes, we have actually 3 pillars of nomadism, and then he draws a triangle on the globe. And he goes, do you see it? And the practical member goes, this is hopeless.
It makes a triangle.
Yeah, it makes a triangle. And then he's like, he can't see the music, is what he says. Like, or he can't hear the music, is what he says.
Oppenheimer.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So it's like this sort of like conceptual framework that's, it doesn't have any animus, so you can just kind of like play around all day. And I think that's what Jimerson wants to do. But yeah, like it doesn't keep people in the way like stuff with like weird sort of this is the way the world works explanations that are founded on like hate or animus like do.
Yeah,
so,
yeah. Well, because that's, again, the strange thing is that we don't get, again, there's not a whole lot of description of exactly what like the doctrines of nomadism are, because they're not important.
They're not important.
They're literally bullshit, and you can strip them all out and still like get people in the door, at least at a certain point in time. And yeah, it's just there's nothing there, and so there's nothing to hook people in when they have other things that are vying for their attention. And when it's the 30s and like there's nothing to do, that's one thing, but it's like once people have television, how are you going to keep them in this? And it's like there's no racism, there's no actually good critique of like society. It's just this one guy, or I guess 2 guys, like analyzing the same made up nonsense. It's like if you got really into like the divide between like the Game of Thrones wiki and the A Song of Ice and Fire wiki, and which one you think is like a better description of like the Westeros universe.
Later, when we can mention this briefly, when he's going to give a speech to all the lawyers, the first stop on his campaign trail, he's like, Popper, what speech should I give? Gold, congealed celestial fire, or a short walk through history. And Popper goes, you go through 11 civilizations in that one. There's no time. You're like, those are the 2 things. What? Gold is congealed fire, and then some interminable talk about 11 stages of civilization. like probably wrong, knowing Jimerson, but yeah, so he runs for governor, and nobody's paying attention except for one specific clause, which is the dreaded paragraph 34, which declared that Governor Jimerson, upon taking office, would move quickly to sponsor legislation that would close all the nursing homes and old folks' homes in the state, and further would force all householders in Indiana, rich and poor, to take in their aged parents and care for them at home until death should supervene and they be carried away in the course of nature. So that's what gets everyone pissed off. And suddenly everyone, and like Portis does a list of every single political group in Indiana, says this guy sucks.
And it's from like the local like Nazi party to like the communist periodical, the Daily Thunderbolt or something.
Yeah, they don't want to take care of their elderly parents, which and John, you had mentioned,
and
this,
the elderly parents don't want to be taken care of by their ungrateful, spoiled brat children.
Right, it's mutual. And I think you had said, I think one thing that I like about Portis is that, he's kind of an old-fashioned guy, so you get this approach to aging that I think you don't really get anywhere else. And like in here, this is part of it, but like later he says that he's convinced, like almost every person in one of his books says our fathers were way better than we are. Like the sort of the decline of like of like generations. And then the last book, Gringos, is just about like a canny old man. he's just a cool old guy. So, but like, yeah, so everybody gets pissed off. Everybody chimes in and then say, we don't want this. And so then Popper, not paying attention, goes, we're going to our first campaign stop, which is the lawyers. And we get a hilarious scene where basically Popper gets chased away from the lawyer group by Ferris White, who we haven't talked about. A minor character. He was initially snubbed during the beginning rise of nomadism, where Popper basically voided his membership card because he found him annoying. And then Ferris White just holds that resentment, and he's sort of like the antagonist because he's convinced that they're doing illegal things and he wants to put them in jail, basically because he was snubbed.
Yes.
So, yeah.
So he like at the beginning he's in night law school, and then he somehow like becomes like a fairly respected like member of the legal community. And we didn't mention it, but Popper like was drafted and just like ignored the draft notice.
Oh yeah.
So that's why he has like a warrant for this guy's arrest, and throughout the rest of the book, he only appears maybe 1 or 2 more times after this. He is like, I'm going to personally serve this warrant.
Yeah.
Even like when he's like 70 years old. He's like, I am going to track down Austin Popper and I'm going to personally serve this warrant.
Yeah, I'm gonna
draft dodging.
I'm gonna nail the perp, kind of like like that kind of. And also his nickname when he's a lawyer is Ferris Bulldog White, which is so funny. Those full cheeks is Bulldog White. So, but yeah, he shows up and like interrupts the campaign speech and then basically chases Popper. Popper has to like run into the forest and like lose them.
Yeah, and that is really like. This is kind of the end of Nomanism in a way.
Yeah.
The book continues from here, but this is kind of the last gasp of it as like a relevant phenomenon in the world, I guess. I thought it was really interesting. I was not sure when I was reading it where it was going to go.
Yeah. Yeah.
I could see like a different version of this novel where it's like somehow, by just some strange, Donald Trumpian swing of fortune, he ends up like winning by like 1%.
Or like Popper sort of like becomes the real guy. Like, yeah.
And then it's about that. And kind of like, again, more of like a comic, like alternate history way. But I think given what Portis's preoccupation seemed, that's not the kind of book he wanted to write. He didn't want to do something that like high concept.
And I think that like, and I mean, it could be done, but I think that like loses the sort of people at the ground level, which I think is what it's all about.
Well, it's something that I think about a lot with reading, and I'm sure this is something we'll talk about more in the future. I read a lot of, speculative fiction, to put it kind of in the broadest sense, and I hate a book that lets its like high concept get in the way of like actually being about something. And I think that's kind of the newspaperman's restraint.
Yeah.
He's not going to go that off the wall. He's going to keep it a little more tight because he knows what he wants to what the story he wants to tell is.
And a frequent point of comparison for this book on Goodreads at least is Thomas Pynchon, obviously because it's about conspiracies. But I think Pynchon sort of willfully lets the conspiracy get really big as a way to like explain the world. And he gets lost in the sauce on purpose for what he wants. And I think, like, in many ways, like, I can see the comparison, but yeah, Portis, it's a lot more restrained because it's about the people and sort of like why they're there, as opposed to like, here's this worldview that will explain everything.
This is a novel about characters.
Yeah.
And I think Pynchon, while I like what I've read of him, he's not really a character author.
He's not. I think Dan would maybe stick up for Mason and Dixon, but he's mostly not. So yeah.
You can not be a character author and like have good characters here and there, but it's like I think Portis seems to me like someone who really loves characters, and he lets the interactions between people do the explication of themes for him.
Yeah, exactly. And again, that goes back to me saying like, maybe I'm reading the Midwestern angle a little bit too much, but I like that in a book in the Midwest, it's all characters. There's no like normal Midwest people. And I think, again, there's like a pressure to make yourself a character when you're in the Midwest to kind of stand out. Yeah,
after the episode with the lawyers, almost half the book left.
Yeah.
But from that point, it is really all just, it's the long denouement of Nomanism and really these three men who we've been following so long.
Yeah.
The kind of losing Popper, I think, kind of forces Portis to re-expand the cast just a little bit, which I think he does very well.
Yeah.
Primarily through the character of Maurice Babcock, who I know is a character you also like a lot, Ben. So if you want to tell us a little bit about him.
Yeah, John has pointed out that Maurice is kind of the self-insert for the two of us because he's a bachelor who just kind of likes his hobbies a lot. Also, I want to mention the introduction of Ed briefly. More mention we'll talk about Maurice, but Ed is somebody who shows up, and the important part, he's described as a veteran. And I think as you get more character details, it's clear that he might have PTSD. And since he's not getting care by social services, he's just there. So, like, he sort of helps around, but he's, like, the one slightly guy who could probably use some help that just happens to be there.
He's the head of security, basically, but, like, you don't really get the impression that he would be much good for that.
Yeah, and he's not interested in the lore at all.
No.
Unlike Maurice Babcock. And so we get a nice character introduction. I'm going to read it again because he's just so good at it. Maurice Babcock came late to the temple. He was a darkish man, about 50 years old, of retiring disposition, a court stenographer from Chicago, a Rosicrucian, not fat, but with the soft look of a middle-aged bachelor who has a good job, money in the bank, no debts, and no family responsibilities. Babcock did his job well. He minded his own business. So then it talks about how he takes care of himself. And then he says, his introduction to Gnomonism came one Saturday morning when he was poking about in an old bookstore and ran across a cast-off trove of Gnomon pamphlets and books, including a copy of 101 Gnomon Facts, one of the rare unsigned copies. He bought the lot for a $5 bill, took it home, and read it through with wonder, lost in triangles for the weekend. This is the stuff for me. He knew it at once. This is what I've been looking for. My search for certitudes is over.
Which I think is an experience you and I have both had individually, probably 50 times over the course of our lives.
Yeah. This is it. This is my book. Yeah. And so then he's just in, and he's sort of like the square version of Popper, because he actually is trying to learn and understand the material, and Popper is all about the hard sell. So he sets up, he starts helping out, he wants to really understand what's going on. We get the great introduction then of the Jimerson lag, which is the explanation for why none of this stuff came to be yet.
Well, I think Babcock's really interesting because he is kind of coming in a weird way. Like it has me it makes me think a little bit about the masterful essay by Benjamin, The Work of Art in the Age of Its Mechanical Reproduction.
Yeah.
Because what happens to him is he's someone he has this aura that he finds in this stuff because it's mysterious, and then he meets the guy who wrote it. Oh, and it's this weird, dirty old man. Not dirty like perverted. Dirty as in like he just lives in a dirty house and it's kind of gross.
The big tuber nose came as a surprise.
But there's like almost like a sunk cost fallacy because he wants this certitude. Like he gets that high when he reads the stuff, and he has to believe that like there's something to it, despite all evidence to the contrary.
Yeah, and for instance, somebody at one point tells him that Ed is Nandor, I think, and then later he's like, Ed is not Nandor. But yeah, like he's bought in. He even says at one point, what does he say? The only one he had found come to that. In his head, he could feel magnetic forces gathering. He knew of some people who would be surprised when the discharge came, and all for a $5 bill. What did the bookseller buy with it 1/2 so precious? So like, yeah, he's really committed to making this work, and I think his position is kind of like a guy who is financially secure enough that he can spend time studying stuff and trying to find quote-unquote certitudes.
He's someone who's not desperate, and so he has time to think about these questions that maybe if he didn't have money in the bank or he did have familial obligations, he would not.
Yeah.
But it's something that you and I talked about this a little bit ago. It's interesting where if you're someone who doesn't have kids and doesn't have like a demanding job, you have to fill your hours with something.
Right. Yeah.
And for some people it's like occultism, for some people it's art, for some people it's podcasting. Just again, I think kind of an interesting thing about aging again in kind of a way where it's just like, when you're kind of out of this phase of your life where it's like you're on the treadmill to like get to this point. Once you're there, it's like, I still got like 40 more years left. What am I gonna do with all that time?
What am I gonna do? And Babcock spends it by moving into basically like an abandoned building with these guys and then working so hard that he has like panic attacks. Like, because it's described, he's like, one day he lay on his recliner for 2 days without moving or speaking. He lay there with his mouth open and his hands clenched at his sides, unable to speak or raise his head. Birds might have lighted on his face and walked around. So he just works so hard that he just lies there. And then it says, no one disturbed him. A long lion was hardly an occasion for comment in the red room.
Babcock shows up and is kind of trying to maybe get Gnomonism like sparking again.
Yeah.
Only to have his hard work immediately thrown out as soon as who shows up again with Mr. Austin Popper.
Popper's back.
Apparently with a case of decade-long amnesia.
Yeah, he shows up. It's described as he has basically a house. It was a camper van with a roof extension, a white plastic carapace. A constellation of 7 white stars was painted on the side of the van, and under the stars there were white words: Big Dipper Energy Systems, Corpus Christi, Texas. And basically Popper gets out and he's like dressed in like full cowboy getup, and he's like, I'm an oil man. I sell oil securities. And also that I don't remember anything. And he gets a long, like 5 or 6 page monologue of his like drunken hobo days, basically. Like, and we can't go through all of this, but I will point out that there's a quick reference to a character from Dog of the South who is also a snake oil salesman named Rayo Symes. He gets a very brief mention, which is a nice little bit of like kind of, you know, Portis universe kind of. But that's it. He gets mentioned in an aside and then it just moves on. Also, what was that line about the president? He doesn't even know who the president is.
He says he had amnesia for like 10 years. The 50s are all gone. President Eisenhower might as well ask me about John Quincy Adams.
And he's just like I don't remember anything. And then he eventually sort of like gets himself together basically and starts and he meets Moorhead Moeller in Texas. And Moorhead Moeller was dangled in a single sentence early in the book, so he doesn't come out of nowhere. But there was one guy keeping the faith of Nomonism in Texas this whole time.
Yeah, he's mentioned as kind of an early convert when kind of they're in their like direct to mail phase.
Yeah.
Back in like the 20s or 30s, and then this guy just kept kept the faith going. It references that he apparently has been sending the temple letters regularly for, again, at this point, decades, and Jimerson has just never been bothered to like even check the mail
because he's too sunk in his studies. He's just looking something up.
No one else cared enough to look either or respond. But
and I'll say Popper and Babcock have some very hilarious exchanges. One of which is basically Popper proposes that they move to Texas, and Babcock says the climate in the southern folkways down there would not suit us at all. Popper says, suit you? Who are you? You have no standing here that I recognize. For one thing, I am keeper of the plumes. I take my duties seriously. Now, you like Texas, Mr. Popper. That's fine. It's just a place for you, a big place offering plenty of scope for your life of sly maneuver and sudden departure. I think your work is there, and I think you should leave us to our work here. Popper turned to Mr. Jimerson. You allow this secretary of yours a good deal of liberty. Maurice is a good boy. Maurice is a middle-aged boy. Is a boy going to lead us into a new cycle? I can't believe you would put yourself in the hands of this rabbit secretary. And then later he calls him a pantry man. So he goes, go to, you are a pantry man. But so they're fighting because Popper wants to move everybody to Texas.
Yes, because basically Moorhead Moeller is very wealthy and he's like, hey, if you guys move down here, like we can get something going.
Yeah.
But they don't. Exactly.
Right. Yeah.
So again, at this point, we're in kind of the denouement. Again, this book is kind of a peak, then a valley, then a tiny peak, and then just a long trailing denouement, which I guess is what aging is like, I assume.
Yeah, it feels like you sort of suddenly lose touch with like the outside world, and you're kind of just like there, like doing what you normally do. Yeah.
But so basically they go down. They do end up going down to Texas, and it becomes it's decided basically that Moorhead Moeller has decided he's going to quash the beef. He's going to get Sidney and Jimerson talking again, and somehow he manages it. The two do reconnect. They're both, again, at this point, ancient.
And he's going to establish this all at the Hall of Nomonism, which is just a really big
trailer.
It's a very big mobile home. Yeah. So,
like out in the middle of nowhere and like West Texas somewhere.
Yeah, West Texas. The Hall of Nomonism. And Moeller is wheelchair bound, and Popper talks about what a great man he is and how when he eats his dessert, he makes sure to get a bite of everything in one spoonful. Yeah.
But I really liked this ending. Again, like this is not like a plot ending. Like this is not like a thing where it's like, oh, all the threads got tied up together and what a great, adventure we just went on. It really ends in kind of like a very like warm, like it feels like getting like diving into like pudding.
Which they eat a lot of banana
They eat
pudding.
a lot of banana pudding.
And they play dominoes. And speaking of that, John, you made a great point. So initially, Moeller's a big banana pudding and dominoes guy. And being that's sort of like his sort of, I don't know, his weakness or something. His pleasures, yeah. And so initially, Sidney Henn and Lamar Jimerson, being serious learned men, are too good for dominoes. But then eventually they realize, hey, the triangles, they apply here. There's some Pythagorean numbers going on here. And then they're like, okay, let's play dominoes. And then they get like really into it. And you had pointed out that it's like, yeah, initially you might be too good for base stuff, but eventually you come around.
What I really like about this ending is, there's something like very comfortable here where it's like, in a weird way, this book reveals itself to have been about found family the whole time.
Yeah.
Because you get the impression, like, here kind of at the end, like, despite the book wars, that Sidney and Lamar like do have this very deep affection for each other that maybe was covered up by the vagaries of trying to make this thing like a thing.
Yeah.
And now that, like, again, people like are talking about how they're going to bring stuff back, but no one at that point is taking it seriously.
Yeah.
Everyone knows that like this is mostly they're doing it for them and maybe for like a few weirdos like Babcock.
Ed is there.
Yeah, Ed. Yeah. Well, Babcock and Ed are kind of a little unique, I think, in that they're actually, I think, just part of the found family at this point.
Oh, yeah.
But there's like that German couple that
the Gooters.
Sydney like has brought along.
Yeah.
And like they just seem like they're just kind of there to gawk.
Yeah.
They don't feel like they're quite as like involved on like an emotional level as everybody else is. But, I think that it is a really good illustration of what people like join this kind of organization for.
Yeah, and what they hope to get, especially maybe in even their advanced age.
Yeah. I think that it's something I think about a lot in terms of just like, we're living in like the time, it's hack to say, but it's like we live in the time of like no community. We're all just sitting behind our phone screen alone, like posting into the void, and like maybe you have people on the internet that you consider like your friends, but you've probably never met them in real life.
Right.
Obviously not every, this is exaggerating to some degree, but that's kind of the stereotype. It's like
bowling alone.
Bowling alone. Nomanism could not exist today because you'd have to get more than 3 people to leave their apartments.
Yeah.
But I think that like what you realize, like, I don't know, again, it's hack to say, but yeah, at the end of the day, like, no matter how high seeming like the ideals of your organization is, like the reason you join an organization is for human contact, to know other people. And I just found the ending of this book so sweet. Like, again, the vagaries and the mysteries fall away, and we're left with just like 3 old guys like having fun, like eating pudding and playing dominoes every night as they just kind of while away their golden years.
Yeah, and Portis does a great trick, I think, where he dangles the possibility of a bad ending. Because Molehead Moeller's like, I'm giving a big announcement tomorrow, and like Ed's like, I think they're gonna kick us out. Like, and so you see suddenly like this weird like possibility that things aren't gonna work out. And then Moeller reveals that they just got a new mobile home.
He's bought a second trailer with 2 bedrooms, one for Jimerson and one for Sidney.
Yeah, for the 2 masters. yeah. And at which point Babcock realizes that Nandor, Principato, and the lame one are Sidney, Lamar, and Moorhead Moeller, because he's in a wheelchair, and he goes, "It's here! I'm finally here!" like, and he's like, "Things are gonna be great. We're gonna have a new cycle of nomadism, basically."
Yeah. And I think that like there is an element where yes, that's true, because like they want to believe it, but like the new cycle of nomadism is just going to be a bunch of guys hanging out and having like a nice time together.
Yeah, in West Texas, where ideally you won't be bothered, which I think is the book kind of suggesting. Yeah, like there's enough space and sort of like people doing their own thing out here that nobody's going to care.
Yeah. that is the ending of the book. I mean, we have more to talk about.
Well, one last thing about the found family thing.
Yes.
The last line of the book is Ed saying, "This is the best party I've ever been to," which I think to me seals the found family aspect. Like even Ed, who, as I was saying, I think might be a veteran with PTSD, is like there as well.
Yes.
So yeah.
Yes. Yeah, Ben. So that's where this book ends. There is one more kind of episode in this book that we have not mentioned that I think is a really interesting one to look at. Because I think you referenced it earlier, like there is a chance Nomanism might be real.
Yeah.
So there is a bit, again, this is kind of in that post-war chapter where very briefly we zoom in on Sydney.
Yeah.
And Sydney has basically spent the whole war like in Mexico, just kind of like chilling.
Because he had been poisoned with arsenic at one point.
Yeah, he'd been poisoned by arsenic, like I think it's implied by like a gay lover.
Yeah.
And he like had gone to Mexico to recuperate, and like he like gets married and like kind of just dodges the war altogether.
Right. Yeah. And his marriage is sort of like a relationship of convenience. Yeah.
Which has very big boobs.
yeah, Babettes, right? Yeah.
So he dodges the war. He goes back to England after it's over, and he's like, "Oh, it sucks here now. Everything's like gray and depressing, and like his friends who are still alive like don't want to talk about Nomanism. They can't like get a room at the like all the like fancy hotels and like clubs they used to stay at because the war has just ruined everything, and he's kind of become persona non grata just kind of like by disappearing for so long. No one takes Nomanism seriously anymore.
Yeah, his temple on the fashionable street is, I think, gone or been turned into a war use
It's been turned into a government housing for unwed mothers.
Yeah.
And to him, this is, of course, horrifying.
Yeah.
So he packs back up. They decide to go back to Mexico, but he has his man who, is like his footman, but also, I think, loosely implied to be another gay lover.
I think so. Yeah.
Kind of packing up the bags, bring them to the boat, and the guy runs into a very strange man.
Yeah. And he's trying to dispose of this huge bust of Sydney that Sydney was like, I want to donate to the National Art Museum. And then Kinlow ends up basically throwing it over a bridge because he's like tired of carrying it. "Do you mind?" he said in his sharp way to an old man who was blocking the doorway of the rooming house. The man had a bulging forehead. He wore thick glasses and a black bowler hat with a curling brim, a size 9 at the very least, and a black suit with trouser legs that were too short. At his heels, there were arching holes in his socks, providing a glimpse of ankle flesh that was none too clean. His rat-tail mustaches were so void of colors to be barely visible. He made no apology and did not give way. So then immediately he starts asking to talk to Sydney. He's one of the first person that wants to talk to Sydney. And Kinlow doesn't really want to talk to him. He's like, I don't know who you are. I don't want to talk to you.
Yeah, he's just like, who's this filthy beggar accosting me in the street?
And he goes, what do you want? Who are you? My name is Pletho Pappas. I come to speak of clotted bull's blood and of a white heifer that has never known the yoke. How very interesting. My card. Pletho Pappas is long dead. Presumed dead. It suited me to lie low for a season. How very interesting. It is near the time when I shall make many things clear. Would you like to know why our Noman society's not prospering? Let me tell you, sir. It is because there are too many backbiters, cankerworms, and cheese hoppers in positions of authority. Those people must go. I think you're talking absolute bloody nonsense. My card. And the card says, T. Pappas, Eastern Knickknacks, Honorable Dealing. And then the guy says, this says T. Pappas. It's not even spelled the same way. A ruse, Theodore. So, a printed card. Your name is Pappas. London is full of Greeks, and I dare say many of them are named Pappas. If you truly are from Greece, I rather suspect Dublin by way of Hyde Park. So Kinlow is not buying any of this, but that line about the bull's blood and he introduces him as Pletho Pappas suggests that maybe it is him.
Well, and also he says, if you look through my glasses, everything will be made clear to you. And of course, Kindale, Sydney's man, refuses to do this.
Yeah.
And at some point he tells Sydney that this happened, and Sydney is infuriated.
Yeah, he's like, you rebuked the lame one or something like, or Nandor. He's trying to decide which one it is.
Yeah. Because it's the book is the Codex Pappas, but it's never again explicated like who Pappas actually is,
right?
Or why he's important. But I just find that very interesting because it's an interesting section because I think that if this character was just like actually like if Portis didn't want it to be ambiguous, he would have just found a way to explain it away. He'd just be like, oh, it was actually just some scam artist or something like that.
Yeah.
But the fact is he doesn't.
He doesn't.
This guy clearly like is at the very least like knowledgeable of gnomonism.
Yeah.
And, you know, I do wonder, like, what happens if Kindle looks through the glasses? What happens if
he sees the world as Plethopappus does?
Yeah. What if he brings that guy to Sydney? Like, is he actually one of the teachers? And I think that the mystery is the point. Like, this is not a book that's about, again, like, there's no answer at the end of the day. That's not what this book is about. But I just really like that note of ambiguity that it leaves. That maybe there is something, you know, underneath all this. Maybe there is a hidden truth that if we do look long enough, we'll find something, and we'll make friends along the way,
which is what it's all about. And I think too, like the sort of, it would make sense that it would be in the guise of another character, which I think is why maybe we and Kinlo write him off. But maybe he is something, you know, maybe something else is going on that we don't know.
Well, I think that, like, you know, they make it clear the 3 secret teachers often appear in disguise.
Right. And I also, that this comes in a moment where, like, Sydney is on the decline, and he says he's so self-absorbed that he turns away one of the 3, you know, old ones or whatever, which is what happened. Like, it's sort of like him kind of realizing he's lost touch in some way.
Yeah. Whew. What a book.
What a book. I love this stuff. Yeah.
But yeah, guys, wonderful book. Very breezy. It's like a little over 300 pages. You can get through it in like a weekend.
And it is, again, one of the funniest books I think I've ever read.
Absolutely. Definitely give this one a shot if you have not.
And, like, if you, like, it's hard to tell, I guess, because we've been reading it, but the effect that I get from Portis is you start chuckling, and then at some point you're just full out loud laughing. Like, the way it, like, builds is something I can't quite describe, and you'll just have to kind of experience it for yourself.
Yeah, so. I know we've kind of given a lot of, we've mentioned a lot of gags, we've read a lot of, like, funny passages here, but kind of out of context, they're not as funny as they are if you're just reading the book and you're really getting the full picture,
because it sort of builds in this way, that I think it builds, which is because of the deadpan. It allows you to kind of like work your way into the joke, and then you're just kind of there. So
this one is absolutely gets a recommendation from me. All right, guys, so last thing before we wrap for today, Ben and I had a new idea for a new segment we're experimentally titling Bad Reads. So obviously, kind of given what we do on the podcast, we're generally have been reading books that we both like. I'm sure as time goes on, we'll either come across one we don't like, or one of us doesn't like, or we have more mixed feelings on. But, you know, we could forgive you for thinking that we only are reading stuff that we think is good so far. But we do think that there is something really interesting in looking at why people don't like books, whether we agree with them and think they have good points or not. There is a social media platform known for book reviews. Not going to mention it here just because don't want to put anybody too on blast. But Ben, I know you like looking at reviews for books on the internet, particularly bad reviews. Can you kind of lay out for us why you like doing that? Why you think it's fun or interesting?
Yeah, so I like finding reviews of books that I've read as well as bad reviews, because I feel that you can kind of see through the review to look at, one, what choices the book makes that are unconventional, and why, one, they might alienate people, and 2, you might see people misread the book deliberately, or for a way that I will call like sort of like modern conventional standards. And I think when you read, especially books that are pre-modern, not like this one, it's interesting to see people apply modern conventions and where those conventions fall wrong. But I think in general, I like reading bad reviews because I like looking at them through to the book to see what choices the book made that might be unconventional and why those choices were made.
Yeah. Cool. Well, you found a real doozy of a review for us to start with this week. Yeah. So why don't you take it away and really let us have the negativity wash over us.
So he gave this 2 stars out of 5. A couple of gullible fools are conned into believing a book of gibberish contains the mysteries of the universe. They establish a secret society based around the text and spend the rest of their lives being idiots. Charlie Portis' Masters of Atlantis is a light comedy satire on cults and secret societies that should never have been a full-length novel, given what little substance there is here. There's no plot or story, just a revolving door of dipshits pretending to each other that they're wise, trying their hands at bizarre get-rich-quick schemes like alchemy, and attempting to grow their cult across America by attaining a measure of influence in the U.S. government, which they, of course, fail at.
There's no plot? Are you going to call the police? Are you going to call your mommy?
He's going to call his English teacher. There's no plot.
Oh my God. You know, this is, I think, an interesting way to start it off, because technically he doesn't say anything here that's like strictly wrong.
Yeah.
Like, if you were going to just sit down and give like a 1-paragraph summary of what happens in this book, you could do worse than that.
It's pretty on the nose.
But like, he clearly he was not interested in like needing the book for what it was trying to do. Like, I find the accusation that like there's no plot here so baffling. Like, yeah, this isn't a plot book. It's not about like one singular like thing that this is all leading up to. It's about characters. It's about, you know, passage of time. It's about all the stuff we've been talking about for over an hour now.
There doesn't need to be a big reveal either.
Yeah.
Like that can be the book. Yeah.
No, it really feels like he read like the first chapter and he was like, I'm smarter than these people, and so I don't really know why I'm reading anything about them.
I personally would never pay for to be a nominist. I'm fine being a perfect stranger. I also find the bit where the revolving door of dipshits, like, I mean, true, but it sounds like he's already kind of portraying himself as smarter. Oh, and what would this even look like as a short story? I mean, I don't think it would work as well as it is.
This book is like like our copies, I think, come out like somewhere like 313 pages. Like, this isn't a long novel, and like it's 313 pages with big margins and pretty big type.
Yeah,
you could easily like edit the formatting on this a little bit and get down to like 250.
Right, if you really wanted to.
Yeah, I don't know how. I mean, I guess you could make like a short story out of maybe like the initial events with Jimerson getting the Codex Papas,
or even the sort of Colorado Popper detour.
Yeah, but like the whole point of this book is the meandering quality to it. Yeah, like you couldn't have something that inspects a life or lives like this in like a short story. I get what he's saying. Like, this isn't like a conventional novel, but there isn't, I don't see a shorter version of this that makes sense, and nor do I think this guy would like it.
Also, like, if a book leaves out things that, you know, you expect, you can either say, well, why did they do this? Maybe they are attempting something. Or you can say, you know what, they messed up. They don't meet the standards that I expect. Fuck them. Like, you know, like, and I think it's more interesting to ask, well, maybe there's a reason for do this. And then if you can't find a reason, maybe then you could say, well, maybe they, you know, like, maybe there's a shortcoming. But you should owe it to the author to expect to find a reason for why, for instance, there's no character development, or why, for instance, there's no big reveal that, oh, this was real the whole time, or there's no, you know, there's many reasons we could say why there isn't a reveal. And we could say, why is that? And we'll come up with a reason, which we've been doing. But I think to sort of just assume that there should be one and then write the book off is unfair, I believe.
Yeah. You want to continue the review?
It gets worse, John. Watching the two deluded, self-appointed masters convince themselves of their brilliance was amusing at first, but once you realize early on that it's not going anywhere and is basically repeating itself with one moron after another, believing they're onto some major secret that doesn't exist, comma splice, it becomes oh so tiresome. One character towards the end sums up the reading experience well with, you get hardly any sense of movement or destination, so I think Portis was at least aware of what he had with this turkey. Wow, so
lied. So didn't get worse.
When you can establish that the author is aware that he's writing a bad book, that means you get points when you're reviewing it. You get 5 good boy points when you can establish that.
Like, again, kind of to double back to what you were just saying, like, maybe there's a reason that they don't learn anything. Maybe there's a reason that Portis doesn't have, like, again, like a traditional plot that everything just chugs along towards. It's like, that's the point. Like, this is a book about life, and life doesn't have a point. I'm sorry, my guy. Like, if you think that at some point you're still getting that Hogwarts letter, it's never happening.
And I guess this isn't exactly a comma splice. I take back my bit. Now I'm like checking the grammar. I'm sorry, reviewer. I think this is. I feel like it's almost like a run-on, but he said once you... Anyway, I agree, John. I'm thinking a little too much of the grammar here. I'm like wondering maybe it's not a comma splice.
Yeah, grad school brain is taking over.
Yeah, I'm having a grad school brain moment. So let me reel it back.
Ben's grad school vein is throbbing in his forehead. It's thrumming.
Yeah, I'm becoming like a scanners when I see grammar, and I go, maybe I said that was actually grammatically incorrect. So yeah,
you're being a grading mentat.
Yeah, my grading mentat. Okay,
your eyes are rolled up.
I'm reeling it back. So I think you hardly get any sense of movement is also just not true. This book goes all over the place. Things are constantly happening.
Covers like 50 years of time.
Yeah, 50 years of time. They go to different states. And if anything, if one character, as we talked about, is not moving, it's a choice. He would rather be in his library. It's a character choice.
Yeah, it's just bizarre thing to say when you. I can't imagine reading a novel with Austin Popper in it being like, there's no movement.
He's described as constantly moving.
The man is moving so much.
Yeah.
He moved so hard he got amnesia for 10 years.
Right. He was like a wandering bum is what he says in that monologue. So he even gets to California. Yeah, this is just that's not correct. All right, moving on. This to me is the real stinker. It's not a successful comedy. I never laughed once because there's nothing really funny here. Nor does it say anything especially worthwhile about secret societies or the psychology behind its members. Portis does keep most of what the Gnomon Society is about enshrouded in mystery for the reader throughout, which is cleverly appropriate given the subject matter, until we get a passage from their Bible towards the end, which reveals that it's full of unreadable, meaningless drivel. But we don't really need to underline how stupid these people are, given that there isn't a single scene that shows them otherwise. I guess it was a joke. Ho, ho.
Yeah, that's the whole point of the book. Like, look, art is subjective. Nobody has the same experience with a piece of artwork that another person has. But yeah, man, great. I think that's what I find so infuriating about like what this guy's writing. It's like there's a part of him like he got it like on an analytical level,
right,
but he's so incurious. Like it's just he's getting the surface level like idea of what's going on, and then he refuses to interrogate any deeper into why Portis might be making these choices, or what maybe that says about, I don't know, the human condition, or, you know, just the condition of these, 3 or 4 people that this book is about.
I guess he needed a character to come in and say, this isn't working. Why do you believe in this? This is nonsense. But, you're supposed to come up with that on your own. Like, there's no character that's going to say that immediately.
No, I mean, like, why would you want that? I don't understand wanting that from this book. Like, it feels like, yeah, he wants somebody to, like, show up and be him. He wants a character to show up and be like, wow, you guys are really stupid. Have you thought about being atheists instead?
I can recommend some good posters.
Have you thought about believing in science and logic?
Well, and it seems like he's unsatisfied with the reveal that he is so desperate to have. And the reveal is that the book is drivel, which we should know is the case already.
I mean, when they show us the passage of the book at the end, it's like, I mean, I didn't dislike it because that's what I figured it was going to be. Like,
right, exactly.
They're pretty upfront from the beginning that it's like, this book is drivel. And maybe it's also right. It can be both. Also,
we didn't really need to underline how stupid these people are, given there isn't a single scene that shows them otherwise. I guess it was the joke, ho ho. It's almost like he would have written the book differently. He would have had a scene when there's a normal person or something.
Yeah, and it's like, no, that's the point.
Also, that indigenous truck driver that Gillespie was racist towards, he's probably the most normal character in the book, and he justifiably points out both of them as idiots, and he gets mad at them. Like he's probably the most normal. Well, also, what is it? June, the girl is also pretty normal.
Yeah,
there's 2 normal characters in the Colorado detour, and it's the indigenous truck driver and June. So
yeah, I mean, but again, it's like that's the point. the point is that these people can't function in normal society, and so they grow increasingly isolated.
Yeah. And they can only hang out with themselves.
I mean, that's the point.
Yeah.
I don't know. It's just this guy, again, like we were saying, this is a podcast about, limited time in the world. What books should you bother with? And at the end of the day, I don't have a lot of sympathy for people who read books that they hate.
Yeah.
And that they clearly just don't like. Like, I'm sorry. A book, yes, is a significant investment of time compared to like a movie or something.
Right.
But this probably took me, 5-6 hours to read.
I feel like it would go book, movie, book, and then video game. Although video game could maybe go before that, depending on the video.
It depends on the game.
Yeah.
And again, you're taking those things in very differently.
Yeah.
I'd say reading and games are interesting because they're both active.
Yeah.
Whereas movies are passive.
Right.
And so it is a lot easier to sit through like a bad movie because at the end of the day, you can just kind of zone out, have it on in the background.
Right. Yeah.
Not saying you should waste your time with bad films either, but it's you're out a lot less.
Right. Yeah.
Again, this is a relatively short book. Still probably took me, 5 or 6 hours to get through. Thing is, you don't have to read it.
Yeah.
It's a book. It's unless this guy was he had to read this for a class or something. No one put a gun to your head and made you read this. Like, why are you forcing yourself to like read something that you think you're better than?
Right.
And again, it's like there's a certain like class of person who like, and I think a lot of people who probably review books on the internet kind of fall into this camp a bit. It's like they are so desperate to show you how smart they are.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And they read, so that means they're smart and they're erudite and they're well read. But again, like there's this anti-intellectual current that I guess probably like at some level just runs through like most American culture. But it's like, yeah, man, you saw things on the surface level. You got what Portis was doing on that first level, but you refused to take it seriously enough to think about why he's making those choices. Why is he doing what he's doing? Because that would require, I guess, work. Or again, as you're reading this review, I just keep getting struck over and over again. Like, this guy just thinks he's so fucking smart.
Oh, yeah, and that what you said also reminds me of the beginning where I was saying that maybe he's saying, do you want to read Freud's interpretation of dreams? And he goes, actually, not really. I'd rather read this other thing. Like, it's a lot more esoteric. Like, yeah, I think if you wanted to talk about anti-intellectualism in this way, it's sort of like a lack of wanting to ask further questions once you've got the surface level thing.
Yeah. I mean, again, I think this reads as, again, like a guy who wrote like a Wikipedia plot summary.
Yeah.
Or wrote a Wikipedia plot summary. But again, there's no analysis deeper than just that.
He does, and the one compliment he appears to pay it in at least this paragraph is the fact that the Gnomon society is shrouded in mystery is cleverly appropriate given the subject matter. That's the one time he goes, okay, Portis did something cool, and then immediately goes back to, like...
and again, there's this element here where, again, yeah, this is a satire on cults and secret societies, but again, what's the point of literature?
Right.
We're not, to quote Freud, well, not to quote Freud, actually, cigar's never a cigar, just a cigar, unless it is.
Yeah.
But in this case, the cigar is not just a cigar. Portis is talking about secret societies as like a way to look at a lot of things. Like, it's not just about, it's about just the ways that we choose to like spend our limited time on Earth. Yeah. And for some people, yeah, that's mystical gobbledygook and bullshit. For some people, it's writing book reviews on the internet. Right. And guess what? In the grand cosmic scheme of things, they are equally meaningless and just as much waste of time. Except one maybe could lead you to God. The other one will not.
And yeah, with that in mind, I guess we should get to the last paragraph, which is not as fun as the previous ones, but it's still worth reading. I got the strong impression that this would make a really good Wes Anderson or Coen Brothers movie. The Coens directed the latest version of Portis' best-known novel, True Grit. Great movie, but I wasn't as impressed with the book. Guess I'm just not a Portis fan, as it has the same kind of eccentric characters and absurd tone of movies like Rushmore and Burn After Reading. In their hands, this material might well turn into gold, but in Portis's, Masters of Atlantis remains a very dull and unremarkable novel about nothing.
I mean, I agree with him about the Wes Anderson thing, like I already said at the beginning of the show, but...
Gotta give him that.
Yeah, I gotta give him credit.
Also, the last sentence is just incorrect. It's about something. And I feel like that last sentence is what I like to call, borrowing a term from DFW, a rhetorical boner, which is when you get really turned on by the style of what you're saying, when you don't stop to consider that the style has no backing. So, like, yeah.
Well, like, I feel like it's about nothing is such... like it's a midwit thing to say, for lack of a better term. Yeah. Like you're not giving the void its due.
Well, right, and if anything, that's more about a failure to attempt to read something into it than about the objective supposed fact.
Nothingness is something interesting.
Yeah,
like I think there is like an element where this book is about like, you know, again, like whether or not like there is anything meaningful in the world, or whether we are all just distracting ourselves.
Yeah,
that's interesting.
Yeah,
like that's not like it's that you could say that's about nothing, but yeah, it's like I don't know. Again, it's like I read this review and it's like, okay, man, what's something to you then? Like, what would this have, like? Would it have been better if, like, I don't know, it was about Trump? Like, what does this guy want this to be about? Like, what's a good like cult satire look like to somebody who cannot like seemingly get past the absolute surface level of the content?
I feel like a character would have to come in and point out that it's all bad.
Yeah,
like there would have to be some outsider. Which, like,
and it's about how, and then it's about like how facts and logic are good,
or like, yeah, like there's no. I think the fact that there's no moral, and in the reveal kind of confirms what we knew all along. Like normally, I think he would want
twist.
Yeah, he would want a twist that gives you the moral, but there isn't.
Yeah, he wants Pomas to show up at the end and be like, oh ho ho, you believed all that, you moron.
Yeah. Pomas is like going like De Niro and Copland. He's like, "You blew it! You fucking blew it!" Like, yeah, like,
and guess what? Didacticism, bad.
Yeah.
So thumbs down. Two big thumbs down to this bozo and his bad review.
but as we said, I think you could use it to say like, okay, here are the things the book is doing, and there's a reason behind them as opposed to there not being.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. But also, rest in piss, bozo.
Got him.
All right, guys. Well, we're going to leave it there. Thank you so much for joining us here in the Infinite Library once again. Join us again in 2 weeks. We're going to have a very special episode. We're going to be talking about The Dragon Waiting by John M. Ford, and we're going to have a very special guest to help us discuss that book. So until then, pick up Masters of Atlantis, give it a read if you haven't already, and Semper Books.
Don't be a perfect stranger. Feel free to email us if you have any book ideas, and Semper Books.
Thank you for listening to the Infinite Library. If you liked our show, we hope you'll subscribe and leave us a review on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or the podcast app of your choice. It helps us a lot. If you want to follow us on social media, we can be found on Twitter, Instagram, and Blue Sky at Infinite Library Pod. If you'd like to contact our team directly with episode ideas or feedback, you can email us at infinitelibrarypod@gmail.com. Our intro music is by Amos Legend in the Forest of Mayhem. Our outro music is by DJ Daggy Diggs, and our logo was created by Lars Noir. You can support our show by supporting them. We hope you'll join us back in the stacks for the next episode soon. Semper Books, bookheads.